Hello and welcome. My name is Amanda Hornberger. I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks. Tonight is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it marks 77 years since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1945. On this annual day of commemoration, the United Nations urges member states to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and millions of other victims of Nazism, and to develop educational programs to help prevent future genocides. In honor of the memory of the millions murdered during the Holocaust, tonight we will hear from students about the impact of our recent Violins of Hope educational outreach programs. Our keynote speaker is Philip Boehm, the translator of The Passenger, which was written by a German Jew in the weeks following Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, which was seen as many historians as the starting point of the violence that was the Holocaust. Boehm will tell us why this recently discovered novel is still relevant to readers over 84 years after it was written. During events like this, it's really easy to become overwhelmed. 6 million is an almost impossible number to comprehend. So tonight, I invite you to try to remember the names from one family, the Hecks, whose story I will share tonight, and that students learned during Violins of Hope educational visits. Violins of Hope was brought to Berks County through a special partnership between the Jewish Federation of Reading and the Reading Symphony Orchestra. It is a collection of over 50 string instruments, including violins, violas, and cellos, with connections to the Holocaust. The collection is restored and cared for by Amnon and Ashi Weinstein. During our class visits, we put the collection into historical context by explaining their place in World War II history, but also in terms of Jewish history as well. Our lesson focused on individual choices that were made before and during World War II that led to lives being saved or people being killed. We shared archival photos with students so they could put faces to individuals who played these instruments in the ghettos and camps throughout Europe. Finally, we shared personal stories behind the instruments, like this violin that belonged to Fanny Hecht. This violin has a beautiful sound, and inside the violin, the year 1743 is written, so it's a very old instrument. Alex and Fanny Hecht had two sons, Fritz and Ernst. They lived in Belfort, Germany. When the Nazis took over, they left for Holland and found a new home in Amsterdam. There, Fanny, a violinist, befriended a Christian neighbor, Helena Visser. Helena and her daughter also played violin. In 1943, the Nazis rounded up most Jews living in Amsterdam and sent them to the Westerbroek transit camp and later on to Auschwitz. Fanny Hecht was worried. She was afraid that her family would be arrested like so many other Jews. So one evening, she knocked on the door of Mrs. Visser and asked her to hold on to the violin in case the Hecht family would be deported. Fanny told Mrs. Visser, "I want you to take care of my violin. I don't want the Germans to have it. And after the war, when we come back, you can give it back to me. And if not, the violin is yours." Shortly after, the Hecht family was arrested and sent away. Ernst, age 17, died in Sobibor on an extermination camp in Poland on July 9, 1943. Fanny and Alex, the parents, were killed in Auschwitz on September 17, 1943. The eldest son, Fritz, died in Mowanitz concentration camp, one of the sub-camps of Auschwitz, on January 18, 1945. No one from the family survived. Their violin was kept by that Dutch neighbor family, the Vissers, for 74 years. When they heard about the Violins of Hope concerts, they traveled to Israel, visited Yad Vashem, where they researched the history of the Hecks, and upon discovering that there were no survivors in the family, the Visser family donated the violin to Amnon and Ashi Weinstein so that it could play and tell the tragic story of Fanny, Alex, Fritz, and Ernst Hecht. Their violin and story live on through the Violins of Hope. And we were lucky enough to have this violin with us in November with the Violins of Hope collection. It went to many of the school visits that we did. We did over 50 visits, and it actually played in the Reading Symphony Orchestra concert. So it is really a testament to the Hecht family. So tonight, I encourage you to remember the names Fanny, Alex, Fritz, and Ernst Hecht as a way of honoring their memory during Holocaust Remembrance Day. We ended our educational programs by connecting individual choices that students make today with the choices that people made during World War II. We invited students to share their reflections in a one-page written essay, and tonight I'm thrilled that our 6 essay contest winners could join us. For grades 6 to 8, the essay prompt asked students to consider the Violins of Hope presentation. How can you influence others to make better decisions in the future to promote unity in your school and community? Because we're on Zoom, it's a little hard to show our appreciation for all of our winners tonight, but I would ask that if you could, at the bottom, there's reactions. You could do the clapping reaction. This is also a universal sign for clapping on Zoom. I just want you to please show your appreciation for our students and all the hard work that they did. Honorable mention for the 6th through 8th grade went to Jackson Golding. He was a 5th grader from the Jewish Day School of the Lehigh Valley. Congratulations, Jackson.
Thank you.
Our 3rd place winner was Daphne Park, an 8th grader from Northeast Middle School in the Reading School District.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daphne. Our 2nd place winner was Katarina Wengrowski, a 7th grader from Wyomissing Area Junior Senior High School. Congratulations, Katarina.
Thank you.
And our winner was Alexandra Giampetro, an 8th grader from Boyertown Middle School East. I'm now pleased to introduce Alexandra, who will read her essay for you.
Thank you. Plenty of things have happened in history that affects the world today. There are events such as the Revolutionary War, World War I, World War II, and 9/11. There are also small actions that impacted others to do something, like when Rosa Parks didn't give up her bus seat. Small acts like what Rosa Parks did impacts the world around us so much, even if no one knows it. Small acts of benevolence, small acts of nastiness, anything that anyone does impacts people and changes the future, either for better or worse. The people in the Revolutionary War didn't know how the United States would turn out, just like how people in our schools and communities don't know how their actions may affect those around them. We as young people are the future and can change what we don't like to see in our schools and communities, such as bullying. Not many people choose to go the right way and try to change things. They just bystand, or they might even join in on the bullying. Those are the people who can change other people's lives. It's young people like Malala Yousafzai and Greta Thunberg who are helping to change the world, and everyday people can help make their community or school a place of unity and friendship. One way to influence people to make better decisions is to stand up by those who are bullied. People are teased, taunted, picked on, and hurt every day. Everyone either gets bullied or is a bully at some point in their lives, even if they don't know that they're bullying someone else. Discrimination against people who are different from others is also a form of bullying. By standing up to bullies and pointing out what they're doing, you can help make the world a better place. You could change a person to be their better self and encourage others to do the same. By standing up against bullies, you could help prevent future bullying. Encouraging others to do the same thing would convert everyone into better people, which in turn makes the community we are a better place. A second way to influence others to make better decisions would be to start a movement. By starting a movement to prevent bullying, eliminate discrimination, or even to just stand up for what you believe in, will encourage other people to stand by your side. In doing so, others would stand up for what is right, such as treating everyone the same. Thomas Jefferson once said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, meaning that we are all the same on the inside, no matter what." Starting a movement like Rosa Parks had done when she didn't give up her bus seat could fix some of the problems within the community, such as judging others because they're different. Also, by getting other people on board, you would get more people to stand beside you and trying to change your community. A third way to influence others to make better decisions would be to treat everyone with kindness. Kindness has sort of a ripple effect, and if you would decide to be nice to others, they would do the same back. Acts of kindness also could help people who are just generally having a bad day. By being kind towards the people in our community, others would feel compelled to do the same, since being nice to people lifts their mood and would make them want to do the same for others. If people just kept spreading kindness around the school or community, it would be a much better place and for everyone. In conclusion, there are quite a few ways for someone to influence people to make better decisions in their school and community. You could stand by those who are being bullied, start a movement, or even just be kind. If people started doing these things in their school and community, it would be a happier place for everyone.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That is exactly what I think we all need to hear. You did an amazing job Thank you so much for sharing with us. The essay prompt for the students in grades 9 to 12 focused on the violins of hope as a creative way to encourage students to remember that in the face of genocide, we are responsible to remember Yistak Lampton's reflection of never again. In what ways can you take action to ensure that never again becomes a reality in your school and community? And I'm honored to recognize our high school winners for grades 9 through 12. Oops, sorry about that. Third place was Elizabeth Diaz, a 10th grader from Wilson Senior High School. I think Elizabeth is with us. Hopefully we can pin her up here in a second. Congratulations to Elizabeth. Our second place winner was Jacob Bowling, a junior from Oldie Valley High School.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jacob. Oops, sorry. And our winner was Freya Osterel, a senior at Oldie Valley High School. And I'm now pleased to introduce Freya, who will read her essay for you.
Thank you very much. As we continue to remember the Holocaust as the largest and most horrifying instance of genocide in history, it is important that we take responsibility to prevent events like this from ever occurring again. The intent of committing hateful acts towards members of a particular group is never a sudden, random urge. This type of hostility begins with ignorance. Therefore, I believe that it is my responsibility to advocate for the marginalized groups in my school and my community. I will amplify the voices of victims of hate in my community and use my own voice to spread awareness, because this will prevent internal hatred from escalating to a scale of systematic oppression or violence. However, I know I must be willing to learn from my own biases and continue to educate myself as well. Everyone has biases, but it is the willingness to acknowledge them and be willing to change that prevents devastating events. The ability that we have to use our own voices to advocate for what is right is often one that we forget to be grateful for. The perpetrators of tragedies such as the Holocaust cannot succeed without the majority of people being bystanders. Those who do not approve of hateful acts but choose to be silent when witnessing them still cause damage by allowing fear or apathy to stop them from making a difference. Therefore, I know I must never become a bystander to acts of discrimination. I will always be outspoken about my beliefs, even if it means I must disagree with my teachers, classmates, and friends, and I will encourage others to be this way too. After all, it takes people who are willing to advocate for what is right, even in the face of the harshest situations, to ensure that Yitzhak Lamdin's reflection of never again becomes a reality.
Thank you so much, Freya. Wise words indeed. It is up to each one of us to make sure that never again is a reality in our future. So thank you to all the students who participated in our essay contest. Our winners received a Violins of Hope items that were delivered to their school today. We have some more deliveries to make next week, as well as cash prizes. All the essays will be printed in the future editions of Shalom, which is our local Jewish newspaper. If you're interested in a copy, please visit our website, readingjewishcommunity.org. Thank you to the Reading Symphony Orchestra and Jewish Federation of Reading for sponsoring the essay contest, and to the Violins of Hope Education Committee for their help in selecting our winners. I'm now honored to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, Philip Boehm. He has translated more than 30 novels and plays by German and Polish writers, including Herzl Müller, Franz Kafka, and Hannah Krall. For these translations, he's received numerous awards, including NEA and Guggenheim Fellowships, and most recently, the Helen and Kurt Wolff Translators Prize. He also works as a theater director and playwright. He's the translator of The Passenger, hailed as a remarkable literary discovery, a lost novel of heart-stopping intensity and harrowing absurdity about flight and persecution in 1930s Germany. On behalf of Literature Berks, a partnership of the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks, Exeter Community Library, and the Jewish Book Council, please join me in welcoming Philip Boehm.
Thanks so much. And first of all, I'd like to thank the Jewish Book Council for all their help arranging, and especially the Jewish Federation of Reading for inviting me this evening. I'm very sorry not to be there in person. Also, congratulations to the essay winners. I was thinking about what I was hearing and how we remember the past, partly to prevent tragedy from reoccurring, but also to advance awareness of our own place in the world and to help better our communities, whether they're our schools, whether they're local or regional or national. And that got me thinking, and it also will resonate, I think, with some comments after we talk about this book a little bit. So I'm going to read a couple passages from this book entitled The Passenger, written by Ulrich Alexander Boschwitz in the immediate aftermath of the 1938 pogroms that were unleashed by the Nazis, what we now know as Kristallnacht, or Night of the Broken Glass. At the time, Boschwitz was 23 years old and living outside Germany. His father was Jewish, but had died before Ulrich was born, so he and his sister were raised by their non-Jewish Protestant mother. When the Nuremberg race laws came into effect during the early mid-1930s, Ulrich's sister Clarissa moved to Palestine, while he and his mother decamped to Scandinavia. Later, he spent some time in France before moving to England shortly before the outbreak of the war. I'll continue with his biography and also talk a little about how the book came into print some 80 years after it was written in a little bit. For now, though, I'd like to jump right into the story, which starts in Berlin at that same time in November 1938, when the Gestapo and other units were arresting Jewish men from their homes or off the street to be later sent to concentration camps. Thanks to his so-called Aryan looks, however, the Jewish merchant Otto Silbermann, who is the protagonist of this story, is able to move about more freely. And this book begins as he sees a business associate off at a train station before returning home to his apartment. So I'll start from early in the book. He's at a restaurant at the train station. Silbermann wrinkled his forehead. The waiter Silbermann had been looking for earlier without success finally appeared. "Are guests meant to wait for service here or for the trains?" asked Silbermann, his sharp tone expressing his disdain for anything that approached slovenliness or exuded an unfriendly air. "I beg your pardon," answered the waiter. "A gentleman in second class was complaining because he thought he was sitting across from a Jew. But it wasn't a Jew at all. The man was from South America, and since I know a little Spanish, I was called in to help." "I see." Silbermann got up. His mouth contracted into a line, and his gray eyes fixed the waiter with a severe look. The waiter tried to smooth things over. "It really wasn't a Jew," he assured Silbermann. Evidently, the waiter considered his guest to be a particularly staunch member of the party. "I'm not interested in that. Has the train for Hamburg already left?" The waiter glanced at the clock above the exit to the platform. 7:20, he thought out loud. "The train for Magdeburg is just leaving. Hamburg leaves at 7:24. If you hurry, you can still make it. I wish that someday I could go running to catch a train, but people like me..." He brushed a few breadcrumbs off the table with a napkin. "The best would be," he went on, picking up the previous subject, "if the Jews had to wear yellow bands on their arms, then at least there wouldn't be any confusion." Silbermann looked at him. "Are they really so terrible?" he asked quietly, regretting his words even as he spoke them. The waiter looked at Silbermann as though he hadn't understood him right. He was clearly surprised, but also unsuspecting, since Silbermann had none of the features that marked him as a Jew, according to the tenets of the racial scientists. "The whole thing has nothing to do with me," the man said at last, carefully. Still, it would be good for the others. My brother-in-law, for example, looks a little Jewish, but of course he's an Aryan. It's only that he has to constantly explain and prove everything over and over. That's too much to ask of anyone. Yes, it is, Silbermann agreed. Then he paid his tab and left. Unbelievable, he thought, absolutely unbelievable. After leaving the train station, he climbed into a taxi and headed home. The streets were full of people, many in uniform. Newsboys were hawking their papers, and Silbermann had the impression they were doing a brisk business. For a moment, he considered buying one for himself, but then decided against it since he figured the news was bound to be bad and almost certainly hostile, at least as far as he was concerned. He would undoubtedly be experiencing it all firsthand soon enough. After a short ride, the taxi pulled up in front of his building. Frau Friedrichs, the wife of the concierge, was lingering in the stairwell. She greeted him politely, and Silbermann was somehow glad to see that her behavior remained unchanged. As he stepped onto the red plush runner and climbed the stairs, he once again had the sensation that his life was only half real. Recently, such ruminations had become a habit. I'm living as though I weren't a Jew, he thought, somewhat incredulously. For the time being, I'm simply a well-to-do citizen, under threat, it's true, but as of yet unscathed. How is this possible? I live in a modern 6-room apartment. People talk to me and treat me as though I were one of them. They act as if I'm the same person I used to be, the liars. It's enough to give a man a guilty conscience. Whereas I'd like to show them a clearer picture of reality, namely that as of yesterday, I'm something different because I am a Jew. And who did I used to be? No, who am I? What am I really? A swear word on 2 legs, one that people mistake for something else. I no longer have any rights, and it's only out of propriety or habit that so many act as though I did. My entire existence is based solely on the faulty memory of people who essentially wish to destroy it. They just happen to have forgotten about me. I've been officially degraded, but the public debasement has yet to take place. So those are the thoughts that he has as he's headed towards his apartment. And when he gets to his apartment, there's a man there who has been trying to acquire this apartment based on the laws that Jews could no longer own property in the same way. So this man, who claims to be a friend, is practically forcing Silbermann to sell his real estate at prices far less than its true value. And while they're negotiating, at that very moment, the stormtroopers come knocking at the door, and Silbermann is forced to escape out the back. Silbermann hurried down the back stairs. They're probably lying in wait for me, he thought. Ah, I should have stayed. What's going to happen to Elfriede now? Elfriede is his non-Jewish wife. He wondered whether he shouldn't go back. But Findler's there, he reassured himself. A good thing that is, too. The man's a decent person despite everything. If I'd stayed upstairs, I'm sure I would have done something out of desperation, resisted, or actually fired the gun. After all, you have to do something. You can't just let them do whatever they want to you. Not that it would have helped matters. On the contrary, Silbermann realized that if he had fired, it would have been out of fear, fear plain and simple, fear of the concentration camp, fear of prison, and fear of being beaten. Dignity, he thought. A person has his dignity, and that's something you can't let anyone take away. And so he sneaks out the back, and he begins his very peripatetic wanderings as he crisscrosses Germany, taking one train after the other. And on his way, he encounters many different people, some of whom, like Zilberman himself, are attempting to outrun fate. The next passage I'm going to read takes place on a train where he encounters someone like that. Zilberman was very contented to be alone. He drew the curtain, spread a newspaper on the seat cushion where he wanted to place his feet, and stretched out. The whole first class is full of Jews, he thought as he fell asleep. If only it goes well. He didn't sleep very deeply, and frequently woke with a start, frightened and bewildered. Then he would glance around the compartment where he'd left the light on before falling back asleep. The train stopped and soon started up again. The door was shoved aside, and a man peered into the compartment. His attire was very run-of-the-mill, as Zilberman, who had woken up when the train resumed its movement, immediately noticed. He also sensed there was something distraught about the new arrival, and he had the impression that the man was not accustomed to traveling first class. The newcomer politely removed his hat and took the window seat opposite Zilberman. "Excuse me," he said, almost meekly. "I'm afraid I may have woken you. Please go on sleeping. I'm going to make myself comfortable as well." He took off his jacket, hung it carefully on a hook, and once again took off his hat, which he had put back on after greeting Zilberman, and placed it on the luggage rack. Zilberman yawned. "I'm already feeling a little refreshed," he said. He pulled his cigarettes out of his pocket. "Do you smoke?" The other thanked him and reached into the case. Zilberman couldn't help noticing the man's hand. It was red and chapped, and several nails had been split and hadn't grown back properly. Suddenly, Zilberman realized that the other man had no suitcase. "Perhaps he's running from the law," he thought for a moment. But then he observed the man's ruddy cheeks and anxious expression, and when he noticed his brown eyes, Zilberman decided instead that he was sharing the compartment with a Jewish tradesman trying to escape. He considered it unlikely that the man was a con artist, given his staid, petty bourgeois demeanor, but Zilberman nevertheless decided he needed to make sure. "Hard times," he said quite slowly. The other man eyed him suspiciously. "Indeed," he concurred, with a serious tone, but then quickly added, probably to be on the safe side and neutralize his agreement, "depending on how you look at it." "Are you traveling on business?" asked Zilberman with polite interest. The other man reached below his ankle to scratch, bending so low that his face could no longer be seen. "Yes," he muttered. Then he sat up and said, without looking at Zilberman, "Well, then, good night." "Good night," Zilberman replied. "Shall I turn off the light?" the man asked. "It can stay on as far as I'm concerned." "That's fine with me too." For a few minutes, both men were silent, but then the newcomer asked, very quietly, as if he were afraid Zilberman might already be asleep, "When do you think the train will be in Aachen?" "Sometime around 12, I think," answered Zilberman, also instinctively whispering. "Thank you." More minutes passed. Then Zilberman asked if the other man would mind if he opened the door to the corridor to let the smoke out. As if he'd been given an order, the other man leapt to his feet. "Not at all," he said, and slid the door about 10 centimeters to the side. He sat back down and asked, now more bravely, Are you traveling abroad?" "No," said Zilberman. "And you?" "Me neither." The other was quick to reply, "I'm traveling on business." He then quickly added, as if he'd already forgotten Zilberman's earlier question and his own answer, and as though traveling on business necessarily meant staying in the country. "That's right, of course," said Zilberman. The other man had turned to face him, but when Zilberman tried to look him in the eye, he averted his gaze. "What line of business are you in, if I might ask?" I'm making him afraid, thought Silbermann, but I have to know. If he's not trying to get out of the country, then he must be a criminal. And I don't want to fall asleep in the same compartment as a criminal. After all, I have my entire fortune in my briefcase. I deal in furniture, said the other man quickly. Too quickly, it seemed to Silbermann, who had now grown suspicious. Do you have good sales agents? He asked. They're all right, said the man, and looked out the window. I was guessing that you're the head of a firm. The man gave Silbermann an anxious look. What made you guess that? Well, I thought that since you were traveling first class, not many agents can afford that. You must do very well. I'm behaving like a perfect inquisitor, Silbermann thought, and how easily the situation could be reversed. But now he felt that he was the stronger person, and he was resolved to be merciless in his quest for information. I usually travel second class, the man answered, as though he had to explain himself. But they told me there were no seats available in second class. That's why I'm traveling first class. This is exactly how people get trapped in lies, Silbermann thought to himself. If the man had any imagination, he surely wouldn't try to make me believe something as ridiculous as that. There are more open seats in second class than anyone could ask for. And why did he even answer my question? Why is he lying? Why is he taking something that requires no justification whatsoever and offering up an improbable explanation? He isn't a crook. He's far too clumsy for that. Only people who are used to speaking the truth give themselves away like that when they're forced to lie. A Jewish tradesman, of course. My first impression was right. Silbermann fixed his gaze on the man and quietly asked, "Are you Jewish?" "What makes you think that?" the other asked back, distraught, and it was clear how much he wanted to get up and escape the interrogation, but he probably lacked the courage to do so. "So I take it you are Jewish. Do you know where you want to go? Do you have a particular destination in mind?" For a moment, the other man was silent. Then he again asked, "What leads you to think I'm a Jew? Do I look like one?" "Not necessarily," said Silbermann, who was now fully confident and secretly proud of his psychological prowess. He was so convinced of the validity of his premise that he returned to his sleeping position. The other man seemed emboldened by this movement, which was clearly not directed against him. "They stormed my store," he began whispering. Then he jumped up and shut the door, even though the corridor was empty. "I had a cabinet-making shop." He resumed his report, then stopped and asked, "But please tell me, what led you to believe I'm Jewish? You aren't Jewish yourself?" The return question was inevitable, and his voice betrayed hope as well as fear. "I had the impression you were agitated," said Silbermann. "Are you an Aryan?" the other asked, rephrasing the question. Silbermann's lack of response to his first question had probably led the man to conclude that he was dealing with a comrade in misfortune. "I'm also Jewish," Silbermann declared. "Thank God," the other man said, relieved. "So where do you plan to go?" asked Silbermann. Now it was the other man's turn to be suspicious. "I'm not planning to go anywhere," he said evasively. "I'm just traveling. I was advised to travel first class because that was safer, but it wasn't good advice. I can see how badly I stick out here. Tomorrow, I'll take a train back to Magdeburg. Things are bound to have calmed down by then." "You don't want to leave the country?" asked Silbermann. "No, no," the other was quick to reply. "I'm staying in Germany. Despite everything, I am a German." So I'm just going to read one more section. I can find it. Yeah. And as he becomes more and more desperate, Otto Silbermann travels from one train to another and a very law-abiding citizen. And this law-abiding Otto Silbermann is driven to equally desperate measures, and he attempts to sneak across the Belgian border. He had met on his travels a young woman who was affianced to a man who was a chauffeur for a richer person. And this person was taking a sojourn in Aachen near the border. And Silbermann paid this man Franz to help take him to the border. This Franz had actually, who was not Jewish, had spent some time in a concentration camp because he was a leftist opponent of the Nazis. So he was, as a leftist, he was a Marxist, and here he's taking this wealthy Jewish merchant across the border. A light rain began to fall. The drops splashed against Silbermann's face. He hurried ahead as fast as the suitcase allowed. He still felt some of the security that being close to Franz had provided. It's going to work out, he hoped. If only I'd left this crazy suitcase at home. He thought about leaving it in the woods, but opening it and unpacking the money seemed too dangerous. I've lugged it this far, so I'll go on lugging it some more, he thought, when he had to set it down again. Otherwise, the whole slog would have been for nothing. He felt so exhausted that he had to rest for a moment. I wonder if Franz is going to get into trouble, he asked himself. I don't even know his last name. I'll never be able to thank him, but what a stroke of luck, and to think, actually, I have that fat police spy on the train to thank for meeting him. Belgium, he then thought. I'm now in Belgium, and it doesn't look any different. I ought to be mad with joy, but instead, I'm afraid. And it's the same fear I had 5 minutes ago when I was still in Germany. If only he thought. He heard a noise and strained to listen. Weren't those twigs snapping somewhere? He jumped up, lifted his suitcase, and looked around wide-eyed. No, he whispered, no, it's over. I quit. I'm staying right here. I'm staying right here, even if they... But there was no noise. He'd been mistaken. The rain dripped down on him and calmed him somewhat. He picked up his suitcase and set off again. The blister on his index finger had burst from carrying the suitcase, and the pain refused to let up. He switched the suitcase to the other hand. What if I get caught now and sent back to Germany? But that simply can't happen. To make as little noise as possible, he went exceedingly slowly, testing the ground with his feet to avoid any missteps. At least I'm in Belgium, he then thought. I managed after all. The forest began to clear, and through the darkness he could make out something lighter colored. The road, he thought. He started to walk more quickly without paying attention to the noise made by the snapping twigs. When he was out of the woods, he looked around. He felt an almost celebratory sensation. My shadow existence is over, he thought. Now I'll become a human again. After he had carefully scanned the area and failed to see anything suspicious, he crossed the road. Before him was an open field. Keep going straight ahead, he remembered. He jumped over a small ditch and felt the soft, damp, tilled earth beneath his feet. If only I hadn't taken this damn suitcase with me, he again wished. All of a sudden, he heard sounds coming from the forest. Twigs crackled. First one flashlight switched on, then a second, and two figures emerged from the darkness about 20 meters from the place he had just passed and headed in his direction. At the first suspicious sound, Silbermann had instantly thrown himself down and was now dragging his suitcase behind him, which thudded on the ground. His heart was pounding, and he opened his mouth wide to breathe. He pushed his face as close to the ground as his increasingly urgent need for air allowed. Only the blurred outlines of the men were visible. They were standing in the middle of the road, pointing their flashlights this way and that. They conferred in whispers and seemed to disagree as to which direction he had taken, and then they separated. One stayed in place, while the other walked over to the ditch where he shined his light up and down before setting off in the opposite direction from Silbermann. Meanwhile, the man who had stayed put lit a cigarette and started walking very deliberately right toward Silbermann. He seemed utterly sure of himself, almost as though he were mocking both his colleague, who had doggedly continued in the wrong direction and was now 50 paces away, as well as the man who thought he could remain hidden. This can't be. Silbermann prayed that it not be true. This simply cannot be. He can't have seen me, no. At the same time, he knew that the man who was now only 10 paces away could surely hear his fitful breathing. Silbermann pressed his hand against his mouth. Eh bien, a calm voice now said, voulez-vous rester là? The man shone the light in Silbermann's face. Je l'ai trouvé, the guard called out to his companion who came hurrying over. Silbermann had a hard time getting up. Je suis, he began. Vous avez traversé la frontière, the guard interrupted him and once again shone the light in Silbermann's face. Il fait retourner. Je suis un réfugié, Silbermann continued, his voice hoarse. Je suis juif. Tiens, tiens, the guard replied, mais quand même, vous n'avez pas le droit de passer les frontières. Il faut venir avec un visa. Alors venez. In the meantime, the other guard had arrived. You have to go back to Germany. But I'm a refugee. I'm Jewish. They wanted to arrest me. They'll lock me up in a concentration camp. We're not allowed to let you through. Come with us. The men grabbed him by the arm and started leading him back to the forest. The guard who had discovered him carried Silbermann's suitcase and left the talking to his colleague. When they reached the road, Silbermann stopped. I protest, he said. I'm staying here. You don't have the right. You're not allowed to do this. I'm in a free country. You crossed the border illegally. I had no choice. I was persecuted. But everybody can't just come to Belgium. I have papers. I have money. Wait, let me show you. Come on. The guard shoved him ahead. But Silbermann resisted. You have to understand, he said. I can no longer go back. I only intended to stay one day in Belgium. My son lives in Paris. I want to go to Paris to join him. Explain that to the Belgian consul in Germany. We have orders. But I'm not going back. I demand to be taken to the guardhouse. It's not my fault. I had to cross the border illegally. I'm being persecuted. It's not Belgium's fault. We're sorry. They had crossed the road. Silbermann stopped again. I can't go back, he said. It's impossible. He turned to the guard who was carrying his suitcase. Mais oui, mon ami. That's completely possible, the man calmly replied. So with that, I hope that those passages give a sense of the book, of the immediacy of Silbermann's experience, and the fact that it was written at the time these events were happening, make this book valuable as a historical document as well as beyond its own literary merit. So now for just a moment, I'd like to return to the writer's own experience. When the war broke out, he was in England, and since he had a German passport, the British authorities interned him as an enemy alien and shipped him off to Australia on a boat that is now infamous for the maltreatment of the passengers aboard, many of whom were actual prisoners of war. By 1942, however, the authorities realized that people like Boschwitz were not enemies, but refugees. He was allowed to return to the UK, but in October of that year, a German U-boat torpedoed the ship he was on, and he perished along with 361 other souls. In Australia, he had been working on another manuscript, but that wound up lost, along with some corrections he had intended for The Passenger, which had actually already come out in an abridged form in English in 1939, but had not attracted much attention. Decades passed, and in 2015, the German publisher Peter Graf was in Israel, where he was interviewed in Haaretz about a different, recently rediscovered novel. There, Graf was contacted by Clarissa Boschwitz's daughter, who advised the German publisher that he might be interested in a novel that had been written by her uncle Ulrich before the war. Peter Graf was immediately intrigued. He searched and found a German manuscript located in the Frankfurt archive. He obtained permission from the family and made substantial edits in line with what the author had intended based on some letters that he had written to his mother. And so some 80 years after it was written, The Passenger appeared for the first time in its original German. In his review for The Guardian, Jonathan Freeland wrote, "The Passenger is a gripping novel that plunges the reader into the gloom of Nazi Germany as the darkness was descending. It deserved to be read when it was written. It certainly deserves to be read now." And so with that idea, why it deserves to be read now and what it might mean to us today, I'd like to open it up to your own responses and questions.
Thank you so much. You feel free to put responses, questions in the chat. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you. If you have questions, comments, thoughts after that reading, welcome those. As we wait for folks to kind of respond here, how did you get involved in the project?
Well, I was contacted by the U.S. publisher, Metropolitan Books. The publisher there, Sarah Burstel, and I have worked many years, and she herself has a great interest in books of this period, based on her own family history. Actually, she's the daughter of survivors, and was herself born in a DP camp. So anyway, there's a lot of overlap, and we published together. I've translated a number of books, and she's a wonderful editor, and it's just a pleasure to work with her. So that you showed us the cover of the book in the U.S. Interestingly, the British edition, which is published by Pushkin Press in the UK, has a slightly different cover. But no, so Sarah reached out to me and I accepted the commission, and that's how that happened.
We have a question in the chat from Nick Callis, who's one of our local educators. Have you spoken to his family or relatives about the work? And if so, what did they share with you?
I haven't spoken to them directly, but I have spoken to the German publisher who did speak to this relative directly, but I have not personally, but I'm familiar with some of their conversations. Now, interestingly, I just saw in the newspaper a couple weeks ago in Minnesota, in the Star Tribune, which ran a review of this, there was a senator from Minnesota. There is he's retired now, Rudy Boschwitz, and he's actually a cousin of Ulrich Boschwitz, and he was very surprised to. He hadn't even known about this, and he was surprised to read this review in the Wall Street Journal that came out last year, and that was an interesting coincidence.
Judy says that was incredibly moving. Thank you for the beautiful reading. I find it so interesting, like that very first part that you read, when he's in the restaurant and the waiter suggests, well, wouldn't it just be nice if we could just put yellow bands on the Jews and we would just know them? That foreshadowing is almost eerie, knowing the time that it was written and the policies and the things that were to come. Were there other moments like that as you translated that really kind of stuck out to you?
There are several moments, and I call them tragically prescient because, of course, some of them are just, they're almost too much to read. And when you talk about, he talks about how they will be murdered economically at one point. I mean, it's just, and then the other, I chose these passages for a reason, and this last passage in particular, we have a case where he's desperate, he's trying to cross this border. It's illegal, but what is he going to do? And the fact that they took away, he was not allowed to take money out of Germany, but unless he had money, he wasn't going to be allowed elsewhere. And so many countries in the US too had quotas, and there was so much unwillingness on the part of other places to allow people in. And so we live in a world where refugees are there more refugees now than almost any other time. I mean, they're crossing so many borders, and there's so much need, and it gets so politicized in different ways. And then the other thing, that with the waiter, that scene with the waiter is just, well, he's trying to assess who Zuberman is and figure out what tone to take. He just this remark I see in the chat, it's, how am I going to deal with this person? I'm assuming he's just like everybody else. I'm assuming he's a Nazi, and he doesn't realize, and this, it's not just even bystanding, it's this complacency and willing to go along with what is essentially ultimately a big lie. And when we are in a world where we're surrounded by people going along with big lies, and when we see what complacency leads to, and complacency leading to the tolerance of a lie, so the book is remarkably meaningful today, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Rebecca put something in the chat. The first passage remarkably echoes the African American experience in the US. Clear, engaging story puts you right on the train of this experience. Johnny, go ahead. You can unmute.
Thank you very much for this incredibly moving reading, and thank you for translating, of course, as well. I guess my question is, clearly the book is prescient, not only in its own time, but what's going on now. So as a translator and someone who's been involved directly in this environment for so long, and all of us on the tiles as well, what's your sense of hope for today?
Well, I have an interesting relationship with hope of late. I don't know if you ever read Jacob the Liar by Ulrich Becker, and we see in that book how hope turns into something else, and it can be deceptive. So I try my underlying optimism, I keep it clothed with a coat of skepticism. So when I see hope, it's listening to the essays that were read earlier. That's, that there's, because I know that my children do not have prejudices that a lot of people of my generation do. And so I think that gives me hope. Where I look at the political machinations, I look at the demagoguery, I look at the, as I said, complacency and the tolerance of bigotry and the excusing of it, that makes me less hopeful. But then I look at people who are younger than I am, and very young, and that gives me hope.
I put in the chat a link to purchase The Passenger. We also have copies here at our local public library. I highly recommend it. It's definitely, I know I felt sort of anxious almost the whole time, because you don't know what's going to happen to him, and he brings you along on this journey. And it is just, you can imagine how many other people who are feeling similar things and going through other things. It just felt very, very real. Any other questions that we can answer tonight? Thank you so much, Philip, for joining us. We really appreciated it.
It's not in person. I hope to make it up there at some point.
Yes, we would love to have you back in person. Our next literature event is February 7th. We have Mark Sullivan coming to talk about his new book. We hope you can join us. Thank you again for taking time out to remember International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Again, if I can implore you to do one thing, it's to remember the names. So tonight, those names are Fanny, Alex, Fritz, and Ernst Hecht. Just one family out of many who was deeply impacted by the Holocaust. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and have a great night.